Every morning, before the sun touched the horizon, a man named Tokoji would wake in darkness and sit motionless for exactly 1 hour. He would not meditate in the way you might imagine, with peaceful music or guided breathing. Instead, he would close his eyes and watch himself die, over and over again, in vivid detail. He would imagine the arrow that pierced his chest. He would feel the weight of his own body falling to the earth. He would experience the final moment when his eyes closed for the last time, and then, when that hour was complete, he would rise, dress himself, and live the day as if it might be his last. This was not the practice of a man afraid of death. This was the practice of a man who had already died, and therefore had nothing left to fear. Chapter 1. The Ritual of Dying. The samurai did not fear death because they practiced it every morning. This was not mysticism or superstition. This was a deliberate, systematic technology for the mind, a tool used by the greatest warriors of feudal Japan to eliminate the one thing that destroys a warrior's effectiveness: the instinct to preserve himself. When a samurai stood on the battlefield, the difference between those who survived and those who fell was not physical skill. It was mental clarity. The warriors who hesitated, who in the crucial moment thought of their own survival, their families, their future, were already dead. They had lost the game before the first blow was struck. The samurai who won were those who had already surrendered their lives. This is why every morning began the same way. In Japanese, this practice was called shiko, the meditation on death. It was not about morbidity or despair. It was about clarity. When you sit each morning and watch yourself die, something shifts in your mind. The fear doesn't disappear, but it loses its power. The urgent voice inside you that says protect yourself becomes quiet, and in that silence you find something unexpected: freedom. You become capable of action that a living person, a person still clinging to survival, could never perform. This is the paradox that separated the greatest samurai from ordinary men. By accepting death completely, they became invincible in life. Chapter 2. The man who forgot to fear Tokoji had not always understood this principle. When he was younger, he trained as all samurai trained, with sword, with discipline, with endless repetition of form. But there was always something missing. In the practice yard, he was sharp, but in the rare moments when real danger came, something would happen. His hands would hesitate, his breathing would quicken, the fear would surface, and for just a fraction of a second, he would be aware of his own mortality. And in a world where battles were decided in fractions of a second, this hesitation meant everything. It was a teacher named Aisai who finally explained what was wrong. Aisai was very old by then, and he no longer taught many students. But he looked at Tokoji one day during practice and said simply, "You are still trying to survive." Tokoji did not understand. He was training constantly. He was disciplined. He was dedicated. How could he be trying to survive? Aisai explained that the body could be trained to perfection, but if the mind still believed it needed to live, the mind would always betray the body at the critical moment. The mind would flinch. The mind would hesitate. The mind would calculate odds and probabilities and chances of survival. And all of that thinking was death. So Isai gave Tokoji an instruction that seemed strange. Each morning, before the sun rises, you will sit alone. You will close your eyes and you will die. Not symbolically. You will experience your death as completely as your mind will allow. You will feel every sensation of it. And you will do this every morning for 1 year. After 1 year, you will be different. Tokoji obeyed. He had learned long ago that the best samurai were not those who questioned their teachers. The best samurai were those who followed instructions exactly, without modification or doubt. Chapter 3. The First Month. The first few weeks were difficult in ways Tokoji had not anticipated. He would sit in the darkness of his small room and try to imagine death, but his mind would resist. It would wander. It would create fantasies instead of real visualizations. He would think about pleasant things or stressful things, but not about the actual sensation of dying. This, Isai had warned him about. Your mind will fight you, the old teacher had said. It will invent 1,000 distractions to avoid the thing it must face. Do not negotiate with your mind. Sit longer, sit deeper, make the death real. So Tokoji began to change his approach. Instead of trying to imagine death abstractly, he would start with a specific scenario. A soldier would appear in front of him, sword raised. Tokoji would see the blade come down toward his neck. He would feel the impact. He would feel his body falling. He would feel his consciousness fragmenting. He would lie on the ground and feel the cold earth against his skin and feel his heartbeat slowing until it stopped. The first time he succeeded in making this real, in actually feeling the sensation rather than thinking about it, something in his chest broke open. He wept, not from sadness, but from the release of something he had been carrying his entire life without knowing it. Each morning after that, the practice became easier. Not easier in the sense that it felt pleasant. It was never pleasant, but easier in the sense that his mind began to understand what was being asked of it. He was not being asked to be happy about death. He was being asked to know death so thoroughly that it no longer held any power. By the end of the first month, Tokoji noticed something unexpected. He was sleeping better. He was eating with more enjoyment. The colors in the world seemed brighter. When he walked through the garden, he could notice details he had never seen before. By accepting that each day might be his last, he had somehow become more alive. Chapter 4. The Transformation. 2 months into the practice, something shifted inside him. Tokoji was practicing sword forms one afternoon when he suddenly realized he was not thinking about the forms at all. His hands moved with perfect precision, but his mind was completely silent. There was no effort, no calculation, no internal voice directing his movements. His body simply knew what to do. It was the state that all swordsmen seek, the state where technique becomes invisible and only pure action remains. When he stopped, he understood. This was what Isai had meant. By dying every morning, he had removed the thing that made technique impossible, the need to be perfect, the need to succeed, the fear of making a mistake. As the months progressed, Tokoji noticed other changes. In conversations, he became quieter, but his words carried more weight. When conflict arose, he did not react defensively. There was nothing to defend anymore. He had already died. When mistakes happened, and they did, they no longer created the internal storm of shame and worry that they once had. A mistake was simply a moment that had already passed, like all other moments. Nothing could be added to it or taken from it. It was complete. By the time he reached 6 months of the practice, people began to comment on something different about him. They could not quite name it. Some said he seemed more confident. Others said he seemed more peaceful. What they were actually noticing was that he had become truly alive because he no longer clung to life. In the 8th month of his practice, Tokoji faced a genuine moment of danger. A rival from another province came to the village with the intention of testing him. They faced each other with swords, and for the first time in his training, Tokoji felt no fear whatsoever. He felt no urgency. He felt no need to win. He fought with perfect clarity and perfect absence of thought. The victory came not from Tokoji trying to win, but from his opponent fighting against a man who was already dead. A man with nothing to lose cannot be beaten. When it was finished, the rival stood silent for a long moment and then bowed deeply. He had felt the difference. He had fought against a samurai who had truly surrendered. Chapter 5. The Paradox at the Center of Life. This is the principle that transformed the samurai tradition and that remains one of the most profound secrets of disciplined action. The path to fearlessness is not through confidence, it is through acceptance of defeat. The path to invincibility is not through strength, it is through surrender. When you stop trying to survive, you become invincible. When you stop trying to win, you become unstoppable. This is not philosophy that makes sense to the thinking mind. It only makes sense to the body that has experienced it. The samurai understood something that modern people have largely forgotten. We believe that life is something to be held tightly, to be extended as long as possible, to be protected at all costs. And from that belief comes the fundamental anxiety of human existence. We are always afraid of losing what we have. We are always grasping for more. We are always calculating, always strategizing, always trying to control outcomes. The samurai chose a different path. They decided that by releasing the grip, by accepting the loss of everything, including life itself, they would gain access to a kind of power that is impossible when you are still clinging. This is why Tokoji woke each morning and sat in darkness for 1 hour. This is why he watched himself die before he lived another day. It was not morbidity. It was not depression. It was the most practical preparation possible for a life lived with authenticity, with courage, and with absolute presence. Because only a person who has already died can truly live. Chapter 6. The Practice in Your Own Life. You do not need to be a samurai to use this technology. You do not need to face physical danger. The principle applies wherever the human mind encounters a moment that requires complete presence and complete absence of self-interest. When you sit down to do something that matters, whether it is a conversation with someone you love, or work that requires your full intelligence, or any moment that asks for your best, the quality of that moment depends entirely on whether your mind is still trying to protect itself. If you are still calculating whether you will look foolish, whether you will fail, whether people will judge you, then part of your intelligence is devoted to self-protection instead of to the task itself. But if you have already accepted the possibility of failure, the possibility of judgment, the possibility of loss, if you have already died in that moment, then something different becomes possible. Your full power is available. Your full clarity is available. Your full presence is available. This is what the morning practice of Shiko was designed to create. A mind that was no longer divided between the wish to survive and the willingness to act. The samurai would begin their day by sitting with death, and then they would live with complete freedom. We can do the same. Not by sitting for an hour every morning, though some people do, but by understanding the principle, by understanding that the moment you stop clinging, you become free, by understanding that the moment you accept what you cannot control, you gain access to what you can, by understanding that the greatest strength comes not from the will to survive, but from the courage to die. Chapter 7. The Last Breath. In the final years of his life, Tokoji continued the practice that Eisai had taught him. He had not stopped. The meditation on death had become as natural as breathing. And because he had died every morning for so many years, when the actual moment finally came, when his body aged beyond what it could sustain, there was no fear. There was no resistance. There was only the completion of what had been practiced so many times before. He sat down one final morning as he had every morning before, and when he closed his eyes there was no difference between the death he had imagined 1,000 times and the death he was now experiencing. He had prepared so thoroughly that the moment itself was simply another moment in a life lived completely. This is what the samurai understood. This is what we have forgotten. That death is not something that happens to us. It is something that we can meet as equals if we have prepared our minds properly. And that preparation begins not at the end of life, but at the beginning of each day. When you wake tomorrow morning, you have the choice that Tokoji had. You can spend your day clinging to your survival, divided between what you want to do and what you are afraid to do. Or you can spend a moment, it does not need to be an hour, accepting that you will lose everything, including this day, including this breath, including this moment. And then you can live. The samurai knew that the person who has already died is the only person who can truly live. And so they practiced dying every morning, so that when life arrived they would be ready. The question that remains is simple. Are you?